topic of solo carrying has been brought up recently, and more specifically about the top laners not being able to solo carry. But I want to extend that to the entire game and how I think just the potential to solo carry in general is declining. Now, I want to first address the idea that, well, this may sound like it's someone who just can't be able to solo carry because they aren't good at the game or whatever, and so therefore they're spreading the problem out to the entire game instead of themselves, in order to be able to be good and then carry the game. And while yes, this is largely true for the most part within a lot of the populace of players, there then becomes a cap to where you have to rely on your team in order to do the correct plays, at least somewhat, so that you can then take over the game. And this mostly exists at the challenger level and especially the pro play level. Now, the whole idea of solo carrying and how Riot has kind of changed their direction, or seemingly changed their direction, is because Riot's philosophy on the game in the beginning was to output as much content as possible. They didn't give a shit if anything was broken, they would release it and they would just deal with it later. Now, a great example of that is Jax. Jax was incredibly broken in the beginning of the game. Not release Jax. Release Jax, it was like some buggy shit. But Jax in the very beginning of the game was incredibly broken because he had a passive that allowed him to dodge attacks. Now combine this with the item Phantom Dancer, which was incredibly broken too, which gave a percentage added to your dodge. So it suddenly became that you would just stack Phantom Dancers and you would have 50 or 60% dodge on Jax, and that's the only items you would buy. In fact, you for your last item, you wouldn't even have boots. You would just have another Phantom Dancer because it gave move speed anyways. So you were incredibly fast. You had 60% dodge. ADCs couldn't kill you. The only way to kill you was to do AP damage to him and to use abilities in order to kill him. That was the only way. So Jax was incredibly overpowered. But with Riot's whole philosophy is that we're going to output so much shit and so much content that even if there are overpowered things, you have a ban phase so you can ban the most OP things, right? So you could ban Jax entirely until he was fixed. Or not only that, but there's so much OP stuff that a team gets Jax. Okay, well, guess what? Another team gets Sunfire Cape stacking Garen. So there was just a ton of broken stuff in the beginning of the game. So it really didn't feel that bad that you gave them a broken champion, because you got a couple broken champions of your own. And so for the most of this video, I'm not going to be talking about season 1 because largely I think season 1 was just stupid things wrong with the game. There were a lot of bugs, there were a lot of crazy imbalances, and also the competitive scene wasn't developed during the time anyways, so there wasn't an easy way to learn from the best of the best. So it was a drought of information, right? It was very difficult to study what the most optimal way to play the game was, because there wasn't even a lot of guides, champion guides to play the game. So everyone was just kind of figuring out things by themselves. Now, I want to address the idea that just because players are smarter now, somehow that makes up for this solo carrying, and that's why people can't solo carry. And I just think this is a very weak argument. And that, sure, yes, there is better wave control in wave manipulation in the game currently, and jungle helping mid do blue buff is now a thing that's quite common. It wasn't common in the beginning of the game at all. And then you have jungle leashing. It wasn't common in the beginning either. And then you had lane swapping. Well, right, botch that shit. uh, and so yes, that was a thing in the beginning, to where you could swap your bot lane over to the top lane and vice versa, and it was mostly used to avoid a bad bot lane matchup, and then you would pick a top lane champion that was good at farming under tower. Now, since Riot got rid of that shit too, it just kind of refrained, like I said, the potential to kind of outthink your opponent, in the sense that, well, players are smarter now. Well, that kind of goes against that, right? And also, that argument is quite weak because, well, wouldn't players getting smarter also work towards finding a way to solo carry as well too? So I just think the argument doesn't hold a lot of water, especially with the whole other primary examples of Riot removing fundamental things that allow people to snowball their own positions within the game. Now, to get into that, there's the removal of Dragon Gold. This is one of the aspects that a lot of people focus on when they talk about the removal of snowballing and the removal of solo carrying. And that Dragon used to give the team that killed it global gold. I think it was like 250 or 300 gold. And another very important thing that a lot of people forget is it gave global experience. Now, global experience is very important for the solo laners, for the top lane or for the mid lane. And so suddenly the top laner is level 6 and you're level 5 still, and so he goes in hard on you and fucking solo kills you, and then he bases back and he uses the gold that he got from the solo kill and the dragon in order to go back into lane and have a crazy item advantage over you and a level advantage at this point. So it just became this ridiculous snowball effect. And chances are, if you got the first dragon, you also got the second dragon and the third dragon, because your whole team is ahead in both experience and in gold. So this mostly helped the jungler, because the jungler was able to secure this objective, right? So it took a solo carry aspect away from the jungler themselves, because controlling that objective meant a lot towards winning the game itself. So they took power from the jungler, and then they took power from the support. And in a way, this is a way for the support to carry, because I mean, let's fucking face it, the support role, in conventional terms, it's difficult to carry because you're not just solo killing people, right? You're allowing your team to make educated decisions, and that was taken slightly back a bit by the removal of green wards and putting the cap to 3 wards per person. Now, this affects the game largely because if you snowball the bot lane or you snowball your team as the support, suddenly now you can't flood the map with vision. And the whole purpose of flooding the map with vision is so that you can make an educated decision. You can reduce chance that, we don't know if the jungler is within this quadrant or this quadrant because we don't have that covered with vision, but we have vision covered in the 3rd quadrant, right? So it's like, okay, he can't be here, so there's a 50% chance that he could be in one of these 2 quadrants, right? So you slowly reduce that percentage as you have more and more wards. Well, when your team is snowballing, suddenly you can buy more pink wards, you can buy more green wards, and you can flood the map with vision and obscure their vision as well too, and just choke them out. And this is what the Koreans were really good at doing in season 3 and in season 4. And so you choke the vision out, and suddenly they can't even go into their own jungle. They can't do anything, in fact. So removal of green wards largely limited the power from the support role. Now, for ADCs had, everyone talks about the golden age of season 2 and how ADCs were just incredibly overpowered. And it was true. And this was because tank optimization wasn't quite optimized, for lack of a better term. There were a lot less ways to counter ADCs back in the day. Bloodthirster was stronger. It gave 100 AD and more lifesteal when it was fully stacked. Randuin's Omen didn't have the reduced crit passive that it currently has now, which I believe it's you take 20% less damage from critical strikes. And then Thornmail didn't have its effect on lifesteal with the Grievous Wounds passive. So you only took damage from Thornmail if you attacked that user, but it didn't apply Grievous Wounds to you. So the counter to it would be Bloodthirster. It was super effective. And so they affected that aspect in the whole tank item aspect. And then they also reduced the damage on IE. Now IE has less attack damage. And then Blood Razors was actually OP as fuck back in the day. Madred's Blood Razors was crazy because it converted your attack damage to magical damage. I think it was like 3 or 5% or something, but it was enough to where now the enemy tank has to decide, well, is it worth it for me to get a little bit of magic resist, because now 2 of their carries, the jungler and the ADC has Madred's, like, well, fuck, okay, now I'm gonna have to get some magic resist. So it was a lot harder for tanks to optimize their items. Now I want to touch on that a little bit later, of why tank optimization is important, because I think tanks largely run League of Legends in its current state, and I think it's actually one of the most OP classes within the game today. Now let's go back to mid lane. Mid lane, they took a lot of power from assassins. They made it to where, with the LeBlanc rework, to where there's more counterplay because there's delays between her burst damage. And then they also nerfed Zed, and how they nerfed his shadow to where it actually has a delay now instead of being kind of immediate, and they increased the cooldown of it as well too. And then they removed Deathfire Grasp and just the ability to one-shot someone, right? Which wasn't fun, being any other role besides the mid lane AP carry. And so they removed that, and they removed a kind of large ability for the mid lane to solo kill anyone within the game if they got snowballing enough. And so they took a large power from mid lane. And now the hot topic is top lane, and how top lane has slowly dwindled from its previous state, and they've just kind of gutted it. And yeah, I think Hashinshin is right to an extent, especially with the bruisers not having a keystone currently, which, I mean, let's face it, they're going to be fixing that within, a month or two, I would imagine, probably during MSI. I'm assuming that's when they're waiting to change that, so that bruisers can come back into the top lane and not affect pro play. That's just the thing that makes the most sense, right? But they shouldn't have fucked that up in the first place. So, bad on Riot. But in Season 4, TP had a cooldown of 200 seconds. This was nuts. So you had around a 3 minute, or well, exactly 3 minutes and 20 seconds for your TP to be up. So this could mean that you could use your TP kind of frivolously to teleport to the top lane to catch a wave. And also, you could look out for ganks in the bot lane, so you could teleport there and kill the enemy bot lane. And you could also counter gank a lot more frequently. And so teleport just was a lot more useful of a spell back in the day, and top laners really had it good with carrying teleport. And then they increased it in 4.10, so the cooldown was just longer. I think it was 240 seconds, I want to say, or 300 seconds to what we have now. Um, but yeah, the cooldown just gave a ton more agency for the top laners. And then in patch 5.22, they increased the channel duration, and they changed it from 3.5 seconds to 4 seconds. So now, not only do are you have a longer CD on your TP, but now it takes longer to even use it to get maybe to the bot lane for a gank, so that they have more time to react to you teleporting to a minion or to a ward. And so they just took a lot of power from that summoner spell, which then took power from the top laners themselves to try and snowball and get kills. And now let's go to the entire team objectives. Now, Rift Herald went from a buff for your top laner to being a more team-oriented objective. And now this was done also because it kind of just felt bad for the jungler to give this buff to his top laner, especially when it was such a difficult objective to take in the first place. So they changed that to be a more team-oriented objective to bust towers to break open the game. Now, they wanted to take agency more from the top laner and from a singular buff that helps one specific person snowball themselves, and they wanted to make it a whole team-wide thing in a objective that is contested by both teams, which is what it is now. Even in professional play, it is contested by taking the dragon instead of fighting for the Rift Herald. Sometimes you fight for the Rift Herald, but oftentimes your jungler will be on the opposite side of the map, so they'll just end up taking the dragon instead. And then a big change that Riot did was the XP changes in patch 5.23. Now what they did was they put, it was 60% of full level for killing an equal level champion. It was then reduced to 50%. So now you get even less experience from killing an enemy champion. So the people that would solo kill the enemy top laner or enemy mid laner would then suddenly get less XP for doing so. So then you can snowball your XP advantage is hard. So they took agency and they took power away from the solo laners and from the junglers too, in that sense, so that you couldn't take over the game simply by levels. And the last position that they affected, but they kind of redacted a little bit, was the jungle XP changes to prevent junglers from getting put behind. Before, it was you could gank any lane and it wouldn't matter because you would just get levels back. But now they kind of reverted that change to where you are more rewarded for farming instead. And so now you can counter jungle as well too and get ahead in levels that way. And that's a little solo queue tip for you guys. Counter jungling is the key. Help your jungler counter jungle and you will probably win the game. But largely, League of Legends still has its problems with solo carrying. Now, the question is, how do we fix these problems? Now, look, I'm not a fucking game designer. And this problem is complex uh, to then move in the opposite direction of what they've been trying to do since the beginning. So they've been moving so far forward into team oriented play that now to go backwards is even more and more difficult because you have to wade through all this shit that they previously did that kind of fucked up the game. But to start off, I think you revert the XP changes for solo kills, or maybe you change the numbers a bit so that you can gain XP advantages in the solo lanes or even in the duo lane as well too. And then this is probably the most key thing that you change within the game is you nerf tank items. Now, I say this because I think tank is the most overpowered class within the game, because you think of the point of a tank fundamentally, philosophically. The point of a tank is to peel or to be protection for the carries. Now, in order to be protection for your carries, you need someone else to rely upon. So that's why they've made the tank class so strong with all these different items to optimize against the enemy, is because they want you to build a tank. They need you to build a tank. And once you build a tank, the tank is largely useless by himself if he doesn't have something to protect. So suddenly you're having these team comps built around the tank, built around initiation, and built around this big beef to sit within the front line to protect your team. And so your team has to stick together behind this tank in order to function correctly. Well, if you remove power from the tanks, suddenly you have more and more people going damage carries. And when people go damage carries, suddenly they're able to snowball their lead because no one is building resistances. So it snowballs even more and more hard. So that's my theory. I think you should probably nerf tank items a bit, make it to where carries are a little bit more viable so that you don't even necessarily have to have a tank. You can if you want, but it shouldn't be a necessity, and there should be some drawbacks to having a tank within your team. So I think the potential to solo carry is definitely declining in solo queue, but more specifically in higher level play such as challenger or within the general professional scene just as a whole.